The 30 Years' War by Macy Collier. The 30 Years' War was a lengthy and devastating conflict that began in the Holy Roman Empire. The fighting was between the Catholics and the Protestants in Bohemia. The fighting originated under King Ferdinand II, who was a devout Catholic. He was the central monarch behind the disputes. Although there were others involved, King Ferdinand is the one that started the war. When King Ferdinand forced his subjects to convert to Catholicism in 1618, Bohemian Protestants threw governors out the window of Prague Castle in an event known as the Defenestration of Prague. This is a 1648 engraving that shows what happened. This flagrant act of disrespect towards the Catholics initiated the Bohemian period of the 30 Years' War. The Bohemian period was primarily a local dispute with religious motivation, whereas some of the later periods in the war had more political motivation and were more widespread across Europe. At the end of this period, the Battle of White Mountain was fought between the Catholic League and the Protestant Union. The Catholics defeated the Protestants, and the Bohemian period concluded with the Catholics firmly in the lead. During the second period of the war, the Danish period, which lasted from 1625 to 1629, Ferdinand II was still strongly campaigning to the north. His troops were led by Albert Wallenstein, a general that supplied him with many men in the army. But during this part, another important monarch came into play, King Christian IV of Denmark, who was a devout Protestant. He fought back and showed that the Protestants were not eliminated. Christian invaded Germany, but was eventually defeated by Count von Tilly there. His motivation in entering Germany was to protect Protestant princes, but he eventually decided that there were other things more important going on in Denmark at the time. These show some of the major battles and important things that happened in the Danish phase in this map. Catholics continued to gain large victories in the Baltic and Pomerania. And while the Danish phase didn't end with the Catholics in the League, it showed that the Protestants were still strong and not eliminated yet. The Swedish period. The Swedish period lasted from 1630 to 1635. The key figure in this phase was Gustavus Adolphus. He was another central monarch who was king of Sweden and a highly influential general. This time, Gustavus Adolphus fought for the Protestants. The Swedish fighters were supported by French funds, and this was absolutely central to this period, because this is where political motivation started playing a major role. The French were Catholic, yet they supported the Protestants because political reasons were more important than religious at the time for them. This is Cardinal Richelieu, who was the first minister of France at the time. He saw the Habsburgs becoming a greater threat day by day, so he joined up with the Protestants to help subdue the enemy. Gustavus Adolphus became known as the father of modern warfare because he used heavy artillery on the battlefield, which led to a bloody stalemate between the Catholics and the Protestants. After Europe had been in such a devastating war for so long, they were wanting provisions of peace. The Swedish period ended with the Peace of Prague, which was greatly a compromise and left many parties unsatisfied. It protected Protestants in northwestern Germany, but it left everywhere else vulnerable, which this unsatisfactory arrangement led to continued conflict. The French period, which lasted from 1635 to 1648, was by far the most widespread and bloody of the four periods, whereas in the last phase, the Swedish under Gustavus Adolphus were the primary fighters. This time, the French were the primary fighters, supported by Swedish funds. The French were especially unhappy with the Peace of Prague, and they fought back for many years. This was the longest period of the war, and it showed the most bloodshed. The Swedish didn't even re-enter active combat until 1642, and the French, by this point, had established themselves as the dominant power on the Protestant side. In the final battle, the Swedish occupied Prague Castle. This initiated the bloody siege of Prague. Here is an engraving of the siege of Prague that shows the violence and the destruction of the city. Europe had become growing weary of the war by this point, and they started making provisions for the Peace of Westphalia. The Swedish left Prague after they heard of the peace becoming passed. The Peace of Westphalia of 1648. The peace effectively ended the 30 Years' War. It was not all signed at the same time. It was a series of treaties spaced out in the year 1648 between all the sides involved in the war. Firstly, territories switched hands. This map here shows the important change of territories after the war, which states lost and which gained. But more importantly, religious freedom developed. Calvinism became recognized as an official religion, and even people that were not in the right domain to practice their tolerated religion had certain hours that they could practice in public anyway. This became a precedent for the separation of church and state and set an example for future governments. Nonetheless, even though the Peace of Westphalia was beneficial, the war was highly devastating. Approximately 8 million lives were lost, and only 450,000 of those died in battle. This mass destruction led to 20% of Europe's population dying. The many armies traveling throughout Europe led to a high spread of typhus, and peasants were taxed highly to pay for war expenses. The armies often hired mercenaries, and the mercenaries pillaged towns they went through, which left a great danger to peasants. The peasants often did not farm their land, which led to a huge famine. The 30 Years' War was the most influential conflict of the 17th century. Its legacy is worth much thought and discussion because it initiated the separation of church and state, which paved the way for some of the first religious freedom. However, the negative effects of the war are also worth considering. It drastically eliminated a large part of Europe's population, which took years to recover from the plague, famine, and economic struggles brought on by the prolonged fighting. Another important aspect of the 30 Years' War that is worth my research is the modernity of the war. Especially Gustavus Adolphus utilized artillery on the battlefield, and many of the bodies in the war were found with gunshot wounds. One of the most important effects of the war was the legacy it left by settling religious disputes. The Peace of Augsburg did settle some, but it was not a lasting peace. However, 30 Years' War did create a lasting peace for Europe, although it was highly devastating. Here are my references. Thank you so much for watching.